She did not arrive at the belief all at once. It settled in gradually, like dust in a room no one bothered to open anymore. At first, it felt temporary, something she assumed would pass once the right words were said or the right moment appeared. But years have a way of teaching lessons without raising their voice. And slowly, without protest, she learned that her pain did not echo. It landed, stopped, and went nowhere. Not because it was insignificant, but because no one was listening closely enough to register it. The title of her life could have sounded dramatic if spoken aloud, but she never spoke it. She moved through her days with the discipline of someone who no longer expects interruption. Mornings came, evenings followed, and everything in between was handled quietly. There was no collapse, no visible breaking point. Just a steady, practiced calm that came from knowing that drawing attention only led to disappointment. If nothing was asked for, nothing could be denied. That became the rule she lived by. She had once believed that persistence mattered. That if you explained yourself carefully enough, someone would eventually understand. But explanations require energy, and understanding requires interest. Over time, she noticed that both were always in short supply. So she adjusted. She shortened her sentences. She stopped clarifying. She learned how to say it's fine in a way that closed conversations before they began. Not because it was true, but because it was efficient. The family around her did not behave cruelly. That would have been easier to identify. Instead, they behaved as though everything was already accounted for. Meals were shared, messages were exchanged, holidays arrived on schedule. Nothing was missing in a way that demanded concern. And because nothing looked broken, no one thought to check what had quietly worn thin. Distance became normal when it arrived gradually. Silence felt less like abandonment and more like routine. In that environment, expectations lowered themselves without argument. She stopped imagining that someone might notice the strain in her voice or the pauses in her replies. She stopped waiting for questions that never came. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who assume you are fine. She carried that loneliness without complaint, folding it neatly into her responsibilities, her habits, her days. Neglect, in her world, did not announce itself. It blended in. It wore the same face as busyness, distraction, fatigue. No one intended harm. No one actively withheld care. It simply never arrived. And when something never arrives long enough, you stop setting a place for it. She learned to handle things herself, not out of pride, but out of practicality. Depending on others felt inefficient. Hoping felt indulgent. There were moments when she considered speaking up again. Small moments, usually late at night, when the house was quiet and the weight of everything had fewer places to hide. But those moments passed. She had learned that unrecorded pain might as well not exist. If no one witnessed it, if no one acknowledged it, it carried no authority. It could not be acted upon. It could not be addressed. So she let it remain invisible. This invisibility shaped her behavior in subtle ways. She smiled at the right times. She responded quickly to messages. She fulfilled expectations without delay. Being reliable became safer than being honest. She did not want to be difficult. She did not want to explain why something felt heavy when it looked light from the outside. And over time, she stopped believing that anyone would ask in a way that truly required an answer. The stakes were never announced, but they were real. When no one cares, nothing gets documented. When nothing is documented, nothing changes. Systems rely on signals, and she had learned to stop sending them. There were no notes taken, no concerns logged, no records built. Everything important remained internal, unshared, untraceable. Her life continued smoothly on paper, even as the quiet weight of it grew harder to carry. She told herself this was maturity. That expecting less was a sign of strength. That self-reliance was preferable to repeated disappointment. and perhaps some of that was true. But beneath those rationalizations lived a softer truth she rarely visited. A truth that wondered, without bitterness, what it might feel like to be noticed without asking. To be seen before something went wrong, rather than after it became undeniable. She did not know when the assumption fully took hold. Only that one day, it was simply there. Solid. Unquestioned. She moved through her world as someone unseen, and because no one contradicted that belief, it remained intact. Life went on. Conversations happened. Time passed. And the idea that no one was watching felt less like a fear and more like a fact. What she could not see, and had never considered, was that someone had been paying attention all along. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just carefully. Someone small, quiet, and patient had noticed the way her voice softened when she dismissed herself. Had registered the patterns she thought no one saw. And while she had stopped expecting care, that someone had just begun to understand what it required. It was never one defining moment that taught her to stop speaking. There was no single argument, no dramatic rejection she could point to and say, that was when everything changed. Instead, the lesson arrived quietly, delivered in pieces over many years. Each time she tried to explain herself and felt the conversation drift away. Each time her words were met with nods that promised understanding but produced no movement. Over time, she began to recognize the pattern. Not cruelty, not anger, just an absence of follow-through that slowly hollowed out her expectations. She remembered the early attempts clearly, though she rarely revisited them. Moments when she chose her words carefully, trying not to sound emotional, trying not to ask for too much. She would mention how tired she felt, how overwhelmed certain days had become, how something small but persistent was wearing her down. The responses were polite, even kind on the surface. Advice was offered too quickly. Reassurance arrived before comprehension. And then the subject would change, leaving her standing alone with a problem that had briefly been acknowledged and immediately set aside. There were people who listened. That was never the issue. They heard her words, nodded at the appropriate moments, and even expressed concern. But listening, she learned, was not the same as carrying responsibility. Once the conversation ended, so did their involvement. Nothing adjusted. No one followed up. The systems around her remained exactly as they were, unaffected by what she had shared. It became clear that her pain was allowed to exist only as long as it did not require effort from anyone else. Each dismissal, taken alone, seemed harmless. Easy to excuse. People were busy. Life was complicated. Everyone had their own struggles. She understood all of that. What she didn't understand at first was how repetition turned small moments into lasting conclusions. How being gently overlooked again and again teaches a person what not to expect. Gradually, she stopped framing her experiences as things worth discussing. She started solving problems quietly or letting them sit unresolved. Silence became less exhausting than explanation. Over time, silence evolved from choice into habit. She learned when to stop herself mid-sentence. She noticed how quickly conversations moved when she didn't interrupt them with her own needs. There was a strange peace in becoming low maintenance, in being the person who never complicated things. It earned her approval. It kept the atmosphere smooth. And it cost her the belief that her inner world mattered enough to slow anything down. This was not abuse that demanded attention. There were no raised voices, no visible harm, nothing that would alarm an outsider. This was neglect by routine, by assumption, by the quiet agreement that she would manage. It lived in the everyday spaces where no one checked back in and no one noticed what went unaddressed. The absence was so consistent that it blended into normalcy. And because it looked normal, it went unchallenged. She adjusted her expectations accordingly. When something felt heavy, she told herself it was temporary. When she felt unseen, she reminded herself that everyone feels that way sometimes. Rationalizations filled the gaps where care might have existed. They helped her stay functional, dependable, composed. But they also reinforced a deeper conclusion she never said out loud: caring was something that happened to other people. People who asked louder. People who mattered more. Eventually, she stopped testing that belief. There was no point. She had learned the outcome well enough to predict it. Speaking up led to brief attention and long-term disappointment. Staying quiet led to stability, even if it came at the cost of being known. So she chose the option that allowed her to keep moving forward without friction. It wasn't resignation exactly. It was acceptance, practiced and refined. Those around her adapted as well, without realizing it. They came to rely on her steadiness, her lack of complaint, her ability to absorb pressure without visible strain. Her silence reassured them that everything was fine. And because nothing appeared wrong, no one thought to question it. The role fit so neatly that it became invisible. She fulfilled it without protest, unaware of how thoroughly she had been categorized. What she could not see was how this quiet had been noticed by someone else entirely. Not as competence or strength, but as a pattern that didn't sit right. While everyone else accepted her silence as proof that she needed nothing, one child had begun to wonder why she never asked for anything at all. He was still young enough that people underestimated the depth of his attention. Old enough to understand what was being said, but young enough that no one thought twice about what he might be absorbing. His presence blended easily into rooms where adults spoke freely, assuming his focus was elsewhere. They mistook his quiet for distraction, his stillness for absence. In truth, he was watching everything, carefully and without urgency. His temperament had always been like that. He did not rush to fill silence. He did not interrupt conversations with questions meant to draw attention. Instead, he listened. He learned early that adults often revealed more in what they avoided than in what they explained. So he paid attention to the pauses, the unfinished sentences, the moments when someone changed the subject a little too quickly. These details stayed with him even when no one else noticed them. He noticed his mother's voice before he understood its meaning. How it softened when she spoke about herself, as if minimizing her own presence. How it brightened quickly when asked about others, eager to reassure. He noticed how long she waited before responding to messages, not because she didn't care, but because she was choosing her words carefully. He noticed the way she smiled at the end of conversations that had given her nothing back. These things registered quietly, building a picture he didn't yet have language for. He never challenged the adults around him. Not because he agreed with everything they did, but because he understood that confrontation required power he did not yet have. Instead, he observed how decisions were made and who they benefited. He watched how responsibility was passed gently from one person to another until it landed nowhere at all. He saw how listening could be used as a substitute for action, how concern could exist without commitment. Over time, he began to understand how the adult world actually operated. Not as it claimed to, but as it functioned in practice. He learned that urgency was selective, that attention followed convenience, and that silence was often interpreted as stability. He realized that people responded more readily to problems that arrived fully formed, already documented, already undeniable. Feelings alone did not move systems. Patterns did. This understanding did not make him angry. It made him patient. He did not rush to correct what he saw because he sensed that haste would only make things easier to dismiss. Instead, he watched for consistency. He noted how often his mother solved things on her own. How rarely anyone checked back in after she said she was fine. He saw how her quiet competence reassured everyone else while costing her something no one measured. The watch and wait phase began without ceremony. There was no decision made out loud, no moment where he told himself he would do something about it. He simply continued paying attention, refining it. He remembered dates. He remembered outcomes. He noticed how long certain processes stalled and who was expected to absorb the delay. These details settled into him, not as grievances, but as information. Care, for him, did not look like reassurance. He did not offer easy comfort or dramatic promises. He understood, even then, that telling someone everything would be okay meant very little if nothing changed. His care showed up as presence, as consistency, as remembering what others forgot. He stayed close without hovering, attentive without interfering. He let his mother move through her days without questioning her strength, even as he quietly acknowledged its cost. There were moments when he almost spoke. When he nearly asked why things were always this way, why no one seemed to notice what he was noticing. But something held him back. An instinct, perhaps, that speaking too soon would scatter what he was still gathering. He sensed that understanding came before action, and action required timing. As he grew, his awareness sharpened. He began to see connections between moments that others treated as isolated. He understood that nothing existed alone, that each dismissal was part of a larger pattern. And patterns, once recognized, could be traced. They could be shown. They could be made visible in ways feelings never could. What he did not yet know was how or when this knowledge would matter. Only that caring, on its own, was not enough. He had learned that love without structure disappeared into the same quiet space his mother had learned to live in. If anything was going to change, it would not be because someone finally listened. It would be because something undeniable was placed in front of them. The shift did not announce itself. There was no clear line between noticing and recording, no moment where intention hardened into strategy. It happened the way habits do, through repetition. The grandson simply stopped letting details pass through him without leaving a trace. What he once observed and released, he now held on to. Patterns began to organize themselves in his mind, not as accusations, but as sequences that made sense when placed side by side. He started to remember dates without trying. The days when promises were made and the days when nothing followed. The length of pauses between messages. The routines that never changed, even when circumstances clearly should have demanded adjustment. He noticed how his mother prepared herself before certain interactions, how she seemed to anticipate disappointment and soften her expectations in advance. These details accumulated quietly, forming a record that existed nowhere but in him. There were no confrontations. He did not challenge anyone or demand explanations. Emotional appeals felt premature, even dangerous, because they could be dismissed without consequence. He had already learned that feelings evaporated the moment a conversation ended. So he stayed silent, letting adults continue as they always had. Their consistency made his work easier. The more predictable the behavior, the clearer the pattern became. As his understanding deepened, so did his grasp of how systems protected themselves. He began to see that rules were not designed to notice individuals unless prompted in the correct way. Systems responded to structure, to sequence, to documentation that fit their language. He watched how concerns only mattered when they arrived with context, history, and timing. Random pain meant nothing. Organized information meant everything. He was careful not to burden his mother with what he was doing. She had carried enough without realizing it. He did not want her to feel watched or studied, did not want to add another weight to her already quiet endurance. His protection took the form of distance. He kept his attention gentle, unobtrusive, making sure she could continue believing that no one was tracking what others ignored. This secrecy was not deception. It was mercy. The realization came slowly, but once it arrived, it did not leave. This story would not move through speeches or emotional breakthroughs. It would move through records, through accumulation, through moments aligned carefully rather than forced. Change would come not because someone finally felt guilty enough to act, but because acting became unavoidable. That understanding steadied him. It gave his patience direction. Still, he knew that information alone meant nothing without timing. Documentation could sit unnoticed just as easily as pain had. The difference lay in knowing when to let it surface, when the moment would demand it rather than deflect it. And so he waited, holding what he had gathered, aware that the right moment had not yet arrived, but certain that it would. Timing revealed itself as the quiet force that had been missing all along. Not urgency, not passion, not even persistence, but timing. The grandson did not arrive at this realization through theory. He arrived at it through observation, by watching how often the right concern expressed at the wrong moment simply dissolved. He had seen how systems reacted not to need, but to alignment. And slowly, he understood that waiting without direction was no longer protection. It was delay. The decision did not feel dramatic. There was no internal declaration, no shift in posture that anyone could notice. He simply stopped telling himself that patience alone would be enough. Care, he realized, had to move from passive to intentional. Not louder. Not more visible. Just positioned differently. Waiting had gathered information. Strategy would determine when that information mattered. He began with small actions that seemed insignificant on the surface. Adjustments so minor they blended into routine. A form submitted slightly earlier than required. A record requested rather than assumed. A question asked in a context where answers had to be given, not deflected. None of these actions demanded attention. None of them suggested urgency. But together, they began to press gently against thresholds the system could not ignore. He understood those thresholds now. He had watched long enough to see where flexibility ended and obligation began. Systems were built to resist emotion but comply with structure. They dismissed isolated concerns but responded to continuity. They ignored voices but reacted to patterns. And so he positioned what he had gathered not as complaint, but as sequence. Not as protest, but as process. Throughout this, the daughter remained unaware. She continued living inside the belief she had earned over years of repetition, that no one was paying attention, that nothing changed unless she carried it herself. She moved through her days with the same quiet competence, interpreting the absence of noise as confirmation. The idea that care could exist without announcement did not feel plausible to her. Experience had taught her otherwise. That distance between what she believed and what was unfolding created a quiet tension. She did not see the groundwork being laid. She did not know that moments she thought had passed unnoticed were now anchored in a larger structure. Her understanding of the world remained unchanged, even as the conditions around her were shifting. This dramatic irony did not rush toward resolution. It lingered, patient and restrained. The grandson watched carefully as these small procedural movements accumulated. He did not intervene when things stalled briefly. He expected resistance. Systems always hesitated before conceding movement. But he also knew that once the threshold was crossed, hesitation no longer mattered. The process would carry itself forward, indifferent to doubt or disbelief. What mattered most to him was preserving his mother's dignity. He did not want the change to arrive as a correction or a confrontation. He wanted it to arrive as inevitability. Something that happened not because someone demanded it, but because it was now the only acceptable outcome. In that way, care remained intact, free from resentment or exposure. There were moments when he questioned himself. When he wondered whether he was misreading the timing, whether waiting a little longer might have made the shift even cleaner. But those doubts passed. He had learned that certainty rarely announced itself. It emerged only in hindsight. And the conditions now felt aligned enough to trust. Then, without warning or ceremony, an ordinary day arrived carrying something different. A response that had once been delayed came through without resistance. A process advanced without being chased. Visibility appeared where there had only been absence. Nothing about the day felt remarkable on the surface. But beneath it, everything had changed. The grandson recognized the moment instantly. Not because it was loud, but because it was official. The system had acknowledged reality. What had been invisible was now documented. What had been ignored was now part of record. And from that point forward, nothing could return to the way it had been. The daughter sensed it too, though she could not yet name it. She felt the shift before she understood it, an unfamiliar feeling of being responded to rather than managed around. She did not know why this was happening. She only knew that, somehow, something she had stopped expecting had quietly arrived. The response did not arrive with urgency or emotion. It arrived the way official things do, without commentary and without apology. A letter was issued. A process advanced. A requirement was triggered. No one expressed concern in the language of care, but concern was no longer necessary. The machinery had been engaged, and once that happened, intention became irrelevant. Systems do not need to care in order to act. They only need to be compelled. For the daughter, the change felt disorienting. She had not asked for this moment, nor prepared herself for it. One day, things were as they had always been, quietly unresolved and predictably stagnant. The next, there was movement where there had never been any before. Requests were acknowledged. Timelines appeared. Questions were asked that no one had ever asked her previously. She moved through these developments with caution, unsure whether to trust them, unsure whether they would disappear as suddenly as they had arrived. She kept waiting for the explanation that never came. No one sat her down to tell her why things were different now. There was no recognition of what she had carried or how long she had carried it. The system did not reflect on its own delay. It simply proceeded, as though this were the natural order of events. That absence of acknowledgement left her unsettled. Relief and confusion coexisted, neither strong enough to displace the other. What spoke instead were the records. Dates aligned. Patterns surfaced. Gaps that had once been invisible were now outlined clearly enough to demand response. Where her voice had once been too soft to register, the accumulation of information carried its own authority. It did not ask to be believed. It was believed because it fit the rules that governed action. The truth she had lived quietly was now visible in a format the system could not ignore. Throughout this, the grandson remained deliberately distant. He did not step forward to explain, did not claim responsibility, did not look for recognition. His role was complete the moment the process began. Anything more would have shifted attention away from what mattered. This was never meant to be about who noticed or who acted first. It was meant to be about ensuring that action occurred at all. The daughter sensed his presence in small ways. In the steadiness of how things unfolded. In the absence of chaos. Nothing felt rushed or reactive. Everything moved with a calm inevitability that suggested preparation rather than luck. Still, she did not yet understand how this had come to be. She only knew that something had changed without her asking, and that knowledge unsettled her sense of how the world worked. There was no celebration. No moment of triumph. Justice, when it arrived, did so quietly and without spectacle. It resembled resolution more than victory. Procedures were followed. Adjustments were made. Responsibilities were reassigned. The outcome was correct, but it was not comforting in the way emotional validation might have been. It offered function, not closure. As the days passed, the daughter began to realize that the hardest part was not navigating the response itself. It was confronting the time that had been lost before it. The years in which the same information could have mattered, if only it had been presented differently. The moments when things might have changed sooner, if anyone had been watching closely enough. That realization settled heavily, bringing with it a quiet grief for what had been normalized for so long. She did not yet know where to place that grief, or how to reconcile it with the relief she felt. The system had finally responded, but it could not explain itself. And in that silence, one question remained, persistent and unresolved. Not about what happened next, but about why it had taken so long for anyone to notice at all. The realization did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It unfolded gradually, settling into the daughter's awareness the way understanding often does when it has waited a long time to be acknowledged. At first, it appeared as a series of small inconsistencies that did not fit her old assumptions. Things followed through when they once stalled. Questions were answered without being chased. She found herself included in processes rather than circling them from the outside. None of it felt dramatic, but none of it felt accidental either. She tried to dismiss the change as coincidence. Systems, she told herself, were unpredictable. Sometimes things moved without reason. But the consistency persisted, and with it came an unfamiliar sensation. She was no longer bracing herself for disappointment. She was no longer preparing to compensate for silence. The absence of that reflex caught her off guard. It made her slow down, if only to understand what had shifted beneath her expectations. In that slowing, she began to notice her grandson differently. Not in the way one notices a child's growth or routines, but in the way one notices intention. She saw how often he checked details others overlooked. How he remembered timelines she had forgotten to mark. How his presence carried a steadiness that had never demanded attention. These observations did not accuse or flatter him. They simply placed him in a new light. Care, she began to understand, had been operating quietly. Not as reassurance or sympathy, but as structure. Not as words meant to comfort, but as actions designed to endure. The definition she had carried for so long, that care required visibility to exist, no longer held. Care could be silent. It could be patient. It could exist without her consent or awareness. That realization softened something she had kept tightly guarded. With that softening came mixed emotions she handled carefully. Gratitude rose alongside guilt. Relief existed beside an ache she could not immediately place. She wondered how much he had seen, how long he had been paying attention. The idea that a child had noticed what adults had normalized unsettled her. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt clarifying in a way she was not prepared for. She did not confront him. There was no emotional outpouring, no moment of dramatic recognition. She sensed that forcing the moment would distort it. Instead, she allowed the understanding to settle naturally, giving it the same patience it had shown her. In that quiet acceptance, she felt something unfamiliar but welcome. A sense that she had not been as alone as she believed. The grandson remained unchanged. He did not alter his behavior or seek acknowledgement. His consistency was its own answer. That steadiness made it clear that his care had never been conditional. It had not waited for permission or recognition. It had simply existed, practiced quietly over time. This, more than anything, confirmed what she was beginning to accept. The care was real because it did not require response. The generational reversal became impossible to ignore. She had spent years protecting, providing, absorbing. Now she saw that protection had moved in both directions, though she had not known it. The role had shifted without ceremony. He had become a quiet guardian, not by authority, but by attention. This did not diminish her strength. It reframed it. She saw herself not as someone who had failed to be noticed, but as someone whose endurance had been witnessed closely by the one person who mattered most. That understanding brought grace where resentment might have lived. She did not turn her attention backward to assign blame. She did not catalog the moments others had missed. Instead, she allowed forgiveness to take shape, not as absolution, but as release. The past did not need to be corrected for the present to be meaningful. What mattered was what had endured, unnoticed but intact. Still, one question lingered. It followed her through moments of quiet, through the ordinary spaces where reflection had room to breathe. Why did it have to be him? Why was it the youngest, the least empowered, who had seen what others had not? The question was not bitter. It was searching. It asked something deeper about awareness, about responsibility, about who notices when noticing costs nothing but time. She did not yet have an answer. Perhaps she never would. But the question itself marked the final shift in her understanding. Care had not arrived late. It had arrived early and stayed. She had simply not known how to recognize it. In the quiet that followed, nothing needed to be announced. The daughter did not search for language big enough to explain what had shifted, because explanation would have flattened it. The change lived deeper than words. It showed up in how she breathed through her days, in how she no longer braced herself for disappointment before it arrived. She understood now that care, when it is real, often moves silently. While it is working, it rarely feels like anything at all. It does not interrupt life. It supports it from underneath, unseen. She began to see how easily pain had misled her before. Pain demanded attention, but attention was not the same as response. For years, she had spoken in the language of feeling, hoping that sincerity alone would move something. Now she understood why it hadn't. Systems were not built to respond to emotion. They were built to respond to preparation, to sequence, to information placed where it could not be ignored. What finally changed was not her worth, but the way reality was presented. That realization did not harden her. It softened her. The belief that no one cared had once protected her from repeated disappointment, but it had also narrowed her vision. Letting it go felt like releasing a weight she no longer needed to carry. She no longer measured care by urgency or volume. She began to recognize it in patience, in consistency, in the quiet reliability of things that followed through without reminding. Her belief did not just shift. It settled into something steadier, something that did not require proof every day. Her grandson's presence remained as it always had, calm and unassuming. He did not change his behavior because nothing about his care had been performative. He did not step forward to receive acknowledgement, nor did he withdraw now that the work was done. His impact continued quietly, folded into the structure of her life rather than standing apart from it. What he had done did not announce itself because it had never been meant to. It was meant to endure. She did not feel the need to explain this story to anyone else. There was no lesson she wanted to extract and hand over neatly. Some truths lose their power when they are moralized. This one felt more like an understanding meant to be carried privately. Attention matters. Timing matters. And preparation often speaks louder than suffering ever could. These were not ideals to promote, but observations earned slowly, without drama, through lived experience. The calm that followed was not a reward. It was not relief in the celebratory sense. It was alignment. Her life resumed its familiar rhythm, but without the constant undercurrent of resignation. She no longer anticipated being overlooked. She no longer interpreted silence as abandonment. Not because silence had changed, but because she now understood that meaningful things could be happening within it. That understanding allowed her to rest in moments she once rushed through defensively. She forgave herself without ceremony. Not for failing to be noticed, but for believing for so long that invisibility was the whole story. That belief had grown from repetition, not weakness. Releasing it did not require anger or regret. It required acceptance. She could acknowledge what had been missing without diminishing what had quietly existed all along. Grace entered her life not as an event, but as permission to stop carrying old conclusions forward. As time passed, she found herself noticing different markers of care. Not words spoken in moments of concern, but follow-through that arrived without being chased. Not promises, but continuity. Not intensity, but presence that did not fluctuate with convenience. These things did not thrill her. They steadied her. She understood now that some forms of love are not designed to comfort immediately. They are designed to protect over time, even when no one is watching. There was no dramatic ending to the story, no scene that closed the chapter decisively. Life continued, ordinary on the surface, but quietly restructured underneath. She carried forward a knowledge that felt both personal and universal. That the most meaningful forces in our lives often work in silence. That patience can be an act of devotion. And that care does not always look like care while it is happening. If the story left anything unresolved, it was intentional. Not every truth arrives with explanation. Some simply remain, steady and undeniable. And sometimes, the deepest care comes from the one who never announces it. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, it's because it touched something real. Stories like this only travel forward when they're quietly supported by people who recognize patience, care, and timing when they see it. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard again, staying connected makes that possible. And before you go, ask yourself this: who in your life cared deeply for you without ever announcing it, and did you notice them in time?